So welcome to the Statesman. This is the first of this series. We just finished the dialogue, The Sophist. The Sophist is a direct precursor, prelude to what we're going to experience here. I read a brief introduction just a moment ago. And this dialogue is going to continue with the themes of looking for the sophist, identifying the sophist. But of course, what is going to be introduced is the statesman. He's going to be arguing for a concept, I suppose. We'll figure it out, but at least in the introduction it says that this statesman that he formulates is absent in their societies. And what that necessarily means, of course, is that he has an idealized view of what the statesman is, perhaps a form of what the statesman might be. And the current statesman, as anybody would recognize him, does not fulfill his definitions. But again, this is the introduction speaking. When we get into this, I think we'll have some interesting territory to play in. In the introduction, the author says that our conversation partners are going to shift. Instead of Theaetetus being one of the primary conversation partners, Theaetetus being one of the Athenian youths, he's going to be talking to one of Socrates' namesake. And I believe that he is a boy from Cyrene, which is a city in North Africa, a Greek colony in North Africa, today modern Libya. And Socrates and Theodorus, much like the last, are going to give us an introduction. So I'd like to describe for a moment how I have been approaching the dialogues. Usually I'll read 2 pages, I'll stop, and I'll reflect. During the time of reflection, it's an experimental period. It's a period that we come to a greater understanding from what we've read. Most often, I'm unable to interpret what I'm reading when I'm reading. It takes a few times to go over it. And this practice has been, although slow and sometimes tedious, it has been quite fruitful. And while it may take a while to get to the end result, I think the end result is ultimately worth it. Because it helps us understand and I think ultimately move us closer to God. So let's get right into this dialogue. We may be able to read more than a couple of pages to get enough information out of the introduction in order to need to reflect on anything, but we'll see how it goes. Socrates says, "I'm really much indebted to you, Theodorus, for introducing me to Theaetetus, and also to our visitor." Theodorus says, "And perhaps, Socrates, your debt will be 3 times as great when they complete both the statesman and the philosopher for you." Well, yes and no. Shall we say, my dear Theodorus, that we've heard the best arithmetician and geometer putting it like that? How do you mean, Socrates? Because you assumed that each of the 3 were to be assigned equal worth, when in fact they differ in value by more than can be expressed in terms of mathematical proportion. Well said, Socrates, by our God, Ammon, a just rebuke. You've remembered your arithmetic very well, to bring me up on my mistake like that. As for you, I'll get my own back for this on another occasion. But turning to our guest, don't you give up at all on obliging us. But whether you choose the statesman first or the philosophers, make your choice and go through him in his turn. Now the visitor, he says, "That, Theodorus, is what we must do. Since we have tried our hand once, now we must not desist until we have come to the end of what we have in hand. But I have a question. What should I do about Theaetetus here? In what respect? Says Theodorus. The visitor responds, should we give him a rest and substitute him young Socrates here, who trains with him? Or what's your advice? Theodorus says, as you say, make the substitution. Since they are young, they'll put up with any sort of exertion more easily if they take a rest. Now the older, the actual Socrates, he says, what's more, my friend, both of them seem somehow to have a certain kinship with me. One of them you all say is like me in the way he looks. As for the other, he is called and designated by the same name as I am. And that produces a certain relatedness. Well, we must always be eager to recognize those akin to us by talking to them. With Theaetetus, I myself got together in discussion yesterday, and I have just heard him now answering questions, whereas neither applies in Socrates' case. We must take a look at him too. He'll answer me on another occasion. For now, let him answer you. The visitor says, I'll go along with that, Socrates. Do you hear what Socrates says? Young Socrates, yes. Then do you agree to it? Absolutely, says young Socrates. The visitor says, it seems there is no obstacle on your side, and perhaps there should be even less on mine. Well then, after the sophist, it seems to me that the two of us must search for the statesman. Now tell me, should we posit the case of this person too, that he is one of those who possesses knowledge? Or what assumption should we make? Young Socrates says, that's what we should assume. The visitor says, in that case we must divide the various sorts of knowledge, as we did when we were considering the previous individual? Perhaps so. But it's not in the same place, Socrates, that I think I see a cut. Why not? It's in a different place. Yes, apparently. So I want to pause here for a moment, actually. I don't do this too often, but I think it's a useful reflection. Hopefully it'll turn into a useful reflection. Although we really haven't encountered anything particularly philosophically rich, I question that, but compared to where we will be going, this is not something particularly profound on their part. But it's interesting to reflect on what environment we are seeing when a person makes a statement like, well, there's two statements here, questions. The visitor says, in that case we must divide the various sorts of knowledge. He says, the place of division is not in the same place. But he thinks that the cut will come from somewhere else. And I have in my mind the beginning of an image through which we might associate some material experience, like cutting into a piece of bread, physically dividing anything, really. We have this experience. Now this thing that used to be one is now in two. I have to wonder under what circumstances or for what reasons we would do such things. Of course, there are purposeful, practical reasons why. But as we can sort of sling our mind far-flung and imagine all sorts of different things, I think about this cutting into thought, that cuts into concepts, cuts into mind, really. That when we try to see farther, what we do is expand mind farther. And again, this both has experiences that are brought to us quite simply through everyday experience and through our extrapolations. And also, maybe I should add that I was just considering, I saw a headline, I should say, that there's a company out there that is working on mining asteroids. And what a strange business to want to start. As hard as it is for the modern person to even want to enterprise, imagine enterprising in something a bit esoteric, I guess. But the obscurity of the business doesn't really get at the heart of it. It's the heart of the endeavor that I think is most interesting. And along the way, granted, much of this is going to be robotic, I would have to imagine, but along the way, all of those learning experiences must provide us with some better understanding of where we are in the universe. Of course, this universe runs deeply, and I think the reasons why we come to see things about the expansion of sight is because we have sight, we can reflect on its nature, and we could do much to accompany our physical experience. So when I see this cut, and I imagine what we are going to be doing when we are dividing knowledge, cutting into it, or cutting into new identities, what we are expanding, and I want to make a clarifying statement about splitting into different identities. What I mean is, of the split, the mind is serving as the knife, and the reality substrate that I would have to say part of is probably computed in mind, and then the substrate that he continually participates in. When I say computed in mind, I mean the mind as an engine or a machine takes information and is able to build on it and extrapolate from it. This cleaving in two of reality, however small we might cut it, I think is one of these mechanisms by which we come to understand what that reality is. Now, it can be, as I've mentioned, something quite small, but we examine it to its foundations and we learn quite a lot about very many things. And so, at least in part, some of the spirit, I think we should be looking forward to this conversation. So again, the visitor says, "But it's not in the same place, Socrates, that I think I see a cut." Young Socrates says, "Why not?" The visitor, "It's in a different place." "Yes, apparently." So in what direction will one cover the path that leads to the statesman? for we must discover it, and after having separated it from the rest, we must impress one character on it, and having stamped a single different form on the other turnings, we must make our minds think of all sorts of knowledge there are as falling into two classes. That, says young Socrates, I think, is actually for you to do, visitor, not for me. But, Socrates, it must also be a matter for you, when it becomes clear to us what it is. You're right. Well then, isn't it the case that arithmetic and some other sorts of expertise are akin to it, don't involve any practical actions, but simply provide knowledge? That's so. Whereas for their part, the sorts of experience involved in carpentry and manufacture as a whole have their knowledge as it were naturally bound up with some practical actions, and use it to complete those material objects they cause to come into being from not having been before. What of that? Well, divide all cases of knowledge in this way, calling the one sort of practical knowledge and the other purely theoretical. I grant you these as two classes of that single thing, knowledge, taken as a whole. Then shall we posit the statesman and king and slave-master, and the manager of a household as well, as one thing, when we refer to them all by these names? Or are we to say that they are as many sorts of expertise as names we use to refer to them? Or rather, let me take this way, and you follow me. What way is that? Okay, so let's take a little break and go back to a couple of the lines that the visitor had put forth. Much of this is reminiscent of the path that we took to find the sophist. Except our object here, given that it is built on the conversations of the previous dialogue, seemed to be taking on a much larger question. And thinking about this idea of splitting something into two, in the last dialogue, we spoke of that which is and that which is not, being and non-being. We spoke of noun and verb. Subject and predicate. And now I think we have to use these items when we reflect on what is being said here, just to put that forward. So the imagery that comes forth here is that he's interested in discovering the statesman, the path to lead there, but also something much larger, which is understanding knowledge. He wishes to impress one character on the form or the name of the statesman, and then he wants to expand his mind, perhaps backwards out through it, to think of all the sorts of knowledge there are as falling into these two classes. Now, I see both knowledge inward and knowledge outward. It depends on the mechanics of how we're going to approach this, but the knowledge in these two categories, it seems like we're starting with the difficult, or more broad, maybe I should say. Difficult in a sense, I don't want to get too off track, but the more broad concepts, and moving down to something that is more and more specific. So we take knowledge as our broad base, and we split it in two, into the practical and into the theoretical. In one sense, one lives in this potential-minded, spiritual, perhaps, domain. The other is actionable in the physical world, in the substrate of reality. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Let's stick with the physical world. Now, young Socrates says, I grant you these as two classes of that single thing. Knowledge, taken as a whole. I think the visitor latches onto this. He's like, knowledge as a single thing, almost like in a sarcastic manner. He says, then we shall posit the statesman and king and slave master and the manager of a household as well as one thing when we refer to them by all these names. Or are we to say that they are as many sorts of expertise as the names we use to refer to them? So on the one hand, we have the difficulty of understanding the difference between that which is in terms of a broad, centralized concept like knowledge, and the differences that are perforated out against it, while they can still maintain their own identity. And I think this is probably our first course of action, is to recognize this structure, that we can all participate in something that is what is considered to be knowledge, and yet we can be expertise in a small, select aspect of that, both of the theoretical and of the practical. And so he then advises on a new direction, because it would seem that just thinking about having all of these names for things that have maybe some overlap, but also a lot of difference, and then combining them all into one name, or making them all synonyms. While we can do that with some things, I think in this situation, it would be impractical maybe. It would be confusing, surely. It would be more difficult for us to identify and to differentiate. We'd sort of be going more into the sophist's territory, increasing the fog so he can exercise his deception. The second part of this, when he says, when we refer to them by all these names, or are we to say that they are as many sorts of expertise as the names we use to refer to them? Now the answer would be yes, from my mind, with the caveat that there is this thread of participation. If we are going to be going down knowledge, the path of knowledge, then that thread of participation is going to go all the way back up to that singular identity, but also maintain our understanding of the difference among things. And it must necessarily be this way, I think, because as we throw this line down into the darkened sphere, we spread out these branches that have little lights attached to them. And these little lights allow us to see much farther into this sphere, into this minded domain. And so when he's saying things like they, them, he's referring to nothing in particular, nothing specifically, other than the names that he's mentioned, of course. But given that they are not in a tight-knit group that you would expect to easily associate with oneness, at least right away, maybe I should clarify a little bit. There are obvious ways in which there are similarities among them, but what I mean to say is that their participation and their place, perhaps, in society is a bit different, one compared to another. And by this difference, by the referencing they, I think we are afforded at least an opportunity to think about what it would mean that a specific identity, a specific category, for which we can identify expertise and its associated noun, or its associated figure, human figure. We can see all of the different roads that we have potentially to explore there, but also keeping in mind what we had mentioned earlier, that there is this thread of connection that goes between them, that unites them. So back to our reading. The visitor, this one, if someone who is himself in private practice is capable of advising a doctor in public employment, isn't it necessary for him to be called by the same professional title as the person he advises? Yes. The visitor, well then, what we say that the person who is clever at giving advice to a king of a country, although he is himself a private individual, himself has the expert knowledge that the ruler himself ought to have possessed. We will, says young Socrates. The visitor, but the knowledge that belongs to the true king is the knowledge of kingship? Yes. And isn't it the case that the person who possesses this, whether he happens to be a ruler or a private citizen, in all circumstances, in virtue of his possession of the expertise itself, will correctly be addressed as an expert in kingship? That's fair. Next, a household manager and a slave master are the same thing. Of course, says young Socrates. Well then, surely there won't be any difference, so far as ruling is concerned, between the character of a large household on the one hand, and the bulk of a small city on the other. None. So, in answer to the question we were asking ourselves just now, it's clear that there is one sort of expert knowledge concerned with all these things. Whether someone gives this the name of expertise in kingship, or statesmanship, or household management, let's not pick any quarrel with him. I agree. Why should we? But this much is clear, that the power of any king to maintain his rule has little to do with the use of his hands or his body in general, in comparison with the understanding and force of his mind. Clearly. Then do you want us to assert that the king is more closely related to the theoretical sort of knowledge than to the manual or generally practical sort? Of course. In that case, we shall put these things together, the statesman's knowledge and the statesman, the king's knowledge and the king's, as one, and regard them as the same? Clearly, says young Socrates. Well, would we be proceeding in the right order if after this we divided theoretical knowledge? Certainly. So look closely to see if we can detect some break in it. Of what sort? Tell me. Of this sort, we agreed, I think, that there is such a thing as an art of calculation? Yes. And I suppose it belongs absolutely among the theoretical sorts of expertise. Quite. Once it recognizes that there is a difference between numbers, there surely isn't any further job we'll assign to it than judging what it has recognized? No, clearly not. And all master builders, too, they don't act as workers themselves, but manage workers. Yes. Insofar, I suppose, as what the master builder provides is understanding rather than manual labor. Just so. It would be right to say, then, that he has a share in the theoretical sort of knowledge. Certainly. But it belongs to him, I think, once he has given his professional judgment, not to be finished or to take his leave, in the way that the expert in calculation took his, but to assign whatever is the appropriate task to each group of workers until they completed what has been assigned to them. That's correct. So both all sorts of knowledge, like this, and all those that go along with the art of calculation are theoretical. But these two classes of knowledge differ from each other insofar as one makes judgments while the other directs. They appear to do so. So if we divide off two parts of theoretical knowledge as a whole, referring to one as directive and the other as making judgments, would we say that it had been divided suitably? And Socrates says yes, at least according to my view. The visitor: but if people are doing something together, it is enough if they agreed with one another. Quite. Okay, so that's the end of the 2 pages. Let's begin to highlight what we are seeing here. So as the progression goes, distinctions will be made, errors will be corrected. And I think the same is true, of myself as it is for the author. It's going to be an experience no matter what. Everybody has their own experience. Now, when I think about the first illustration, or the first part of the dialogue that the visitor says here on our first page, he says, if someone who is himself in private practice is capable of advising a doctor in public employment, isn't it necessary for him to be called by the same professional title as the person he advises? Now, there are a few things that come to mind here. One is the sort of practical implication of this. It is often, I think it could be said in 2 ways, and in different contexts, that the physician is both provided information from people who are actively doctors, and there are people that provide him with information that he may use in private practice that are not. And there are different types of information. So, for example, one of them that I'm thinking is a physician and his wife, or a physician and her husband, whatever, that in certain cases, perhaps not in, or maybe in, the relationship affords a particular type of advice. Let's say the one is educated in biology and the other a physician, so of course the biological understanding is there. They both share in a complex intellectual relationship, but fundamentally they do different things. And it would be insufficient for us to accept that the biologist would suddenly go into treating patients. However, what we can say is that the biologist is able to say things about the nature of anatomy and physiology that can provide the doctor, provide the physician, the significant other, an avenue toward solving their issues that they have. There are all sorts of different ways that we can go about thinking the to and fro, again, between the mouth behind the physician, again, shrouded in this context that the visitor is providing us, that the person who advises the physician in daily practice or in private practice is the one that has the skill set to be a physician. There are plenty of these examples that we can come up with. Both we can present some that are a bit different, kind of on the margin, where we're not really sure if it participates in the way that the visitor is saying, and we can find plenty for which a person that is advising a physician may also be a physician. The second reflection is that it's interesting to think that there is a sameness in distinction for that sameness in behavior. And my mind immediately goes to one that has went through the institutional route to become a physician, and then one that has not. Of course, our institutions are designed to uphold a certain standard, but I suppose there's no reason why that type of knowledge could not be acquired by one who had not gone through the formal institutional route and played the formal institutional role. At the same time, given this system, though, the one that had done the self-education would not be able to practice. Otherwise, be exposed to all sorts of legal concerns. It brings to mind, in a sense, how delicate our words can be, and how they're just sort of vibrating on these strings of context. If they are moved and altered in some way, we can be deceived quite readily. We can be deceived by one that appears to be a doctor but doesn't have the formal distinctions as a doctor. Perhaps we're deceived by the sophist in this sense, into making somebody believe something that is not, making him believe that he is a physician when he is not, having maybe only superficial knowledge of things, mimicking the physician that he sees, or that he has been in contact with. An interesting example in our society, in our time, is Jeffrey Epstein, this person that has strange ties to a bunch of different institutions and is propped up as being a particular type of person with a particular type of expertise. And yet, really when we follow him up, we find very little formal training, perhaps, to allow him to be in the position that he is at, or have the expertise to find himself in the position that he was. Being a little disorganized with my language there. But nonetheless, I bring him up because he is this sort of classic sophist type figure. Now, the last thing that comes to mind, at least from this first part, is that when we think about separating knowledge, now we have our practical and our theoretical, and we are about to go much deeper in this tree. I find another interesting image that develops, and it's this idea of levels, where level 1 would be knowledge, level 2 would be practical and theoretical, level 3 would be, at least what we have so far, under the theoretical, directive, and judgment making. But what's most important is a person's participation at each particular level. And this is where I think the example here, again, I'll read. If someone who is himself in private practice is capable of advising a doctor in public employment, isn't it necessary for him to be called by the same professional title as the person he advises? And so the question that comes from this, relating ourselves to this forming leveled structure that I had mentioned, is how this is true at a given level. We would say that this is true under the theoretical level, level 2, of those that participate in knowledge. But all of the other intricate details there, I think, are made different by our queen. Our queen, again, being a physical chess piece that I have symbolized to represent that which is not. And there are 4 pawns that I have given to her that are meant to symbolize her participation with difference that these pawns of difference form the boundaries around different identities, allows the mind to be able to grasp difference. I think where we are now, it doesn't reach far enough down on the differential tree in order to completely justify where we are. And it's not to say necessarily that the visitor is incorrect, but rather being more specific will increase the correctness of his claim. And perhaps by the end of it, we may not necessarily come to understand if we saw things at a particular level, let's say level 2, once we reach down to level 9, we may not necessarily see things the same way as we saw at level 2, at the branch of knowledge between the practical and the theoretical. Or at least now, we have yet to understand what the practical and the theoretical are. And so perhaps this is another potential reason why, at this point, being at level 2, our vision is stunted. Not like an absolute type stunted. Once we go through the entire experience, we'll understand level 2's place compared to level 1 and also the deeper levels. Now, the visitor brings up again another example, but this time he uses a king. When we say that the person who is clever at giving advice to a king of a country, although he is himself a private individual, himself has the expert knowledge that the ruler himself ought to possess, or ought to have possessed. And we encounter the same series of questions that I had raised earlier. Of course, we're thinking about a different scale now. Perhaps anybody can fill this position, but they have to have this certain knowledge. Okay, so this relationship is interesting. Of course, we're only talking about, or maybe not only, but what we are talking about is the theoretical types of knowledge. So it makes this type of relationship possible, in other words. He says, but the knowledge that belongs to the true king is the knowledge of kingship. And isn't it the case that the person who possesses this, whether he happens to be a ruler or a private citizen, in all circumstances, in virtue of his possession of the expertise itself, will correctly be addressed as an expert in kingship? So that's, young Socrates agrees. So what about this? Is there anything in particular that we ought to pause and reflect on? It's interesting to think that ruler or a private citizen, a part of me wants to sit and think about the cultural expectations, the approvability or the disbelief of sort of a commoner possessing the skills of one that is born into that life. Here I think particularly about English succession. But let's not get too off topic. Now the visitor gives a few more examples. He says, isn't it the case that the person who possesses this, whether he happens to be a ruler or a private citizen in all circumstances, in virtue of his possession of the expertise itself, will correctly be addressed as an expert in kingship? He moves on to the household manager and the slave master, indicating that they are the same. He says, surely there won't be any difference, so far as ruling is concerned, between the character of a large household on the one hand and the bulk of a small city on the other. The first thing is, I find it quite interesting that in that conception, it would not be unreasonable to assume that the bulk of a small city is in fact made up of slaves. An interesting cultural piece that we get from that, I think. but he's making a functional connection, similarity between expertise and ruling. And all of these other identities, of course, we've discussed this, but all of these other identities, though they differ in certain fundamental respects, they are united by this, what we would call a centralizing knowledge, a level 1 knowledge perhaps, at least conceptually, in the sense that it is shared, unbifurcated. Now the type of knowledge can be bifurcated, which is that journey that we're on. He says, "This much is clear, that the power of any king to maintain his rule has little to do with the use of his hands or his body, in general in comparison with the understanding and force of his mind." So from this, we relate it to the theoretical sort of knowledge of that branch, that level 2 branch, the theoretical and the practical. So the visitor indicates oneness between the noun and the action. In this way, he says, the statesman's knowledge and the statesman, the king's knowledge and the king, we shall put all these things together as one, and regard them both as the same. And to take a brief side road or side path here, I want to mention that sometimes I know that in my own mind I wish to see things such that they might reveal something greater. Sometimes I spend too much time in an area that I know is a bit shallow. Sometimes it's successful, because even in the smallest of relatedness in words we can build quite strong and interesting reflections. I have to say that at times I find myself wondering if it is the best pursuit. Now certainly we'll get to those points where it'll be undeniable. Other points that I might be uncertain, and I need to dwell on it more, such that what feels to be there actually is there or is not there. So I bring that up to say that of my ramblings, they will center on something quite significant, and I recognize that at this point, we are not into very dense territory here. Now with that being said, the visitor continues to divide the theoretical into a directive type and a making judgment type. The two examples that he uses is calculation. He says, of this sort we agreed, I think, that there is such a thing as an art of calculation, and I suppose it belongs absolutely among the theoretical sorts of expertise. But once it recognizes that there is a difference between numbers, there surely isn't any further job we'll assign to it than judging what it has recognized. Now he gives another example using the master builder as his image to expand on. And the master builder is also a person that holds theoretical knowledge, because he doesn't do much manual labor himself, at least not anymore. He more organizes people and then directs them. And so here we have the judgment and then the directive. Now the master builder, it would be hard to say that he does not make judgments. So we have to sort of think about, is there a way in which the use of the word judgment and directive don't interfere between these two? Obviously they come together in the theoretical, so we know that there is this approaching relationship. But on their diversion, I wonder about the nature of judgment making versus the nature of directive making. Now, a judgment is an account of our observation. It's an account of observation of material stimuli, but also of mental processes involving memories and beliefs. It's the consideration that is specific and directed. So in the way that judgment occurs, it is quite a personal thing. We can call it internal. The internal direction of mind. The self-direction of mind. Whereas the directive sense, in the way that we are exposed to it here, given the analogy, it is the external directive. That, of course, the master builder must make judgments. He would not be able to do so if he were not a master builder. In other words, judgments would be impossible if he did not have the capacity to direct himself. Because again, it is by that causes a judgment to be. Now, when we expand this to the external sense, the action is not the physical. Like in calculation, the action is not really physical either. It's the process of mind that calculates. And in here, the master builder, when he makes his external direction, it is still within the theoretical domain because his action in the world and with people is still in the mental sphere. The people that do the labor are the labor hands, the ones that are studying to be the master builders. And this is why the visitor says, but it belongs to him, I think, once he has given his professional judgment, not to be finished or to take his leave in the way that the expert in calculation took his, but to assign whatever is the appropriate task to each group of workers until they complete what has been assigned to them. And so it's direction throughout the whole experience. In my mind, I had this image of the master builder explaining the plans to various groups, various teams, and then lets them go. But of course, the master builder is going to keep on making his rounds through the various teams to make sure that they're doing everything correctly. So at this point, we arrive to our next couple pages. And so I'd like to read them and then go over them once more. The visitor says, so for as long as we are sharing in the present task, we should say goodbye to what everybody else may think. Of course, says young Socrates. So tell me, in which of these two sorts of expertise should we locate the expert in kingship? In the one concerned with making judgments, as if he were some sort of spectator? Or shall we rather locate him as belonging to the directive sort of expertise, seeing that he is a master of others? Young Socrates says, in the second, of course. Then we should need to look at directive expertise in its turn to see if it divides somewhere. And to me it seems that it does so somewhere in this direction, in the way that the expertise of the retail dealer is distinguished from that of the self-seller or producer who sells his own products. So the class of kings appears set apart from the class of heralds. How so? The retailer, I think, takes over someone else's products, which have previously been sold, and sells them on for a second time. Absolutely. Well then, the class of heralds takes over directions that have been thought up by someone else, and itself issues them for a second time to another group. Very true. So, Shall we mix together the expertise of the king with that of the interpreter, the person who gives the time to the rowers, the seer, the herald, and many other sorts of expertise related to these, just because they all have a feature of issuing directions? Or do you want us to make up a name in line with the analogy we were using just now, since in fact the class of self-directors happens pretty much to be without a name of its own? Should we divide these things this way, locating the class of kings as belonging to the self-directing sort of expertise and taking no notice of all the rest, leaving someone else to propose another name for them? For we set up our investigation in order to find the person who rules, not his opposite. Absolutely, says young Socrates. Well then, since this is at a certain distance from those others, distinguished by difference in relation to kinship, we must in turn divide it too, if we still find some cut yielding to us in it. Certainly. And what's more, we seem to have one. Follow on, and make the cut with me. Where? All those in control of others, that we can think of as employing directions, we shall find them issuing their directions, won't we? For the sake of something's coming into being. Of course. And it's not at all difficult to separate into two all of those things that come into being. How? I imagine that, of all of them taken together, some are inanimate and some are animate. Yes. And it's by these very things that we'll cut the part of theoretical which is directive, and indeed we wish to cut it. How? By assigning part of it to the production of inanimate things, part that of animate things, and in this way it will all immediately be divided into two. I absolutely agree. So then let's leave alone one of these two parts to one side and take up the other, and let's divide the whole of it into two parts. Young Socrates says, which of the two parts do you say we should take up? The visitor responds, I suppose it must be the one that issues directions in relation to living creatures. For surely it is not the case that the expert knowledge that belongs to the king is ever something that oversees inanimate things, as if it were the knowledge of the master builder. It is something nobler, which always has its power among living creatures and in relation to just these. Correct. Now, as one can observe, either the production and rearing of living creatures is done singly, or it is a caring for creatures together in herds. Correct. But we'll certainly not find the statesman rearing individual creatures like some ox driver or groom, but rather resembling a horse breeder or cowherd. It certainly seems so, now that you say it. Well then, when it comes to rearing living creatures, are we to call the shared rearing of many creatures together a sort of herd rearing or collective rearing? Young Socrates says, whichever turns out to fit in the course of the argument. The visitor says, well said, Socrates. And if you persevere in not paying any serious attention to names, you will be seen to be richer in wisdom as you advance to old age. But now we must do just as you instruct. Do you see how by showing the collective rearing of herds to be twin in form, one will make what is now being sought in double the field then be sought in half of that? So let's begin and interpret what is being said here. So, keeping in mind that our division tree, we have started with knowledge, we have split it into the practical and the theoretical. Of the theoretical, we have split this into directive and making judgments. Now we are about to split the directive again. And we have two examples. We have one of the self-seller, or producer who sells his own products. And we have already been exposed to this earlier, the self-directive. On the other hand, we have the retail seller, the person who takes a product and resells it, essentially. It is not something that they produce. Now, it appears to me to be clear that the self-directive sort are the more enterprising sort, but they're not just the more enterprising sort. They are the ones with true productive responsibility. And when I say that, I mean that they are at the front lines of translating meaningful information in the mind to what might be considered a way of participating in being. And here I struggle a little bit because there are a lot of ways in which self-direction can manifest, but particularly since we're speaking of kingship, self-direction is no simple matter. For the retail seller, he participates on a structure, a soil bed that has already been laid for him. In the other, I suppose the king operates in a similar manner as well. But the self-directive is the one that does not wait for something to be produced, but rather they produce it, and then they put their product into action, immediately participates in being. There's a much closer relationship to the source of the spirit of the thing. The visitor goes on to say, the class of heralds take over directions that have been brought up by someone else, and itself issues them for a second time to another group. So the herald, in this sense, a translator or transmitter of information, is similar to the retail seller, because he's not the producer, but he is the holder and transmitter of. And so we are brought to this interesting crossroads, I suppose. The visitor says, so, shall we mix together the expertise of the king with that of the interpreter? The person who gives the time to the rowers, the seer, the herald, and many other sorts of expertise related to these, just because they all have the feature of issuing directions. So in here, there needs to be some understanding. It's not immediately clear to me what the visitor means. So he asks, shall we mix together the expertise of the king with that of the interpreter? Now, the interpreter is similar to the herald. The interpreter is similar to the retail seller, in the sense that he takes information that is not his own, and he translates it with a particular skill. This particular skill modifies the information, redirects it, reorients it. Fundamentally has the same meaning, but reorients it such that his role is valuable. So again, the visitor says, shall we mix together the expertise of the king with that of the interpreter? The person who gives the time to the rowers, the seer, the herald, and many other sorts of expertise related to these. Just because they all have the feature of issuing directions. Now, it would seem, much like our conversation before, that when we run into the issue of shared characteristics and of independent essence or the nature of something, we run into, again, a crossroads. That in order for something to be an independent identity, there are unique characteristics that are associated with that identity. For them to participate in a broader ontological significance or participate in being or that which is, they must also have some relation. And I think by their relation there is something that is shared. It could be a number of characteristics. I think in terms of scale, this can be very many characteristics or very little characteristics. He says, or do you want us to make up a name in line with the analogy we were using just now, since in fact the class of self-directors happens pretty much to be without a name of its own. So it wouldn't necessarily make sense to put all of these together. It helps to have the self-directive and the transmitter as two separate classes of the directive. He says, should we divide these things this way, locating the class of kings as belonging to the self-directing sort of expertise, and taking no notice of all the rest, leaving someone else to propose another name for them? For we set up our investigation in order to find the person who rules, not his opposite. So I think the name that can be proposed for this other sort, the retail seller, is the transmitter. He is the medium of direction, the arbiter of flow. From here we take an interesting step, one of the most important and fundamental steps, I think, so far, and that is the division of the self-directive. The first place that we go is the division for the sake of something, the why of the self-direction, and that is for the sake of coming into being. Another word for that would be production, or creation, which is more of a biblical term. And we divide this into that which is inanimate and that which is animate, or that which is not alive, or that is something that is full of life, or having life, a spirit. So from here I'd like to read the next 2 pages. Young Socrates says, I shall try my hardest. It seems to me that there is a different sort of rearing of human beings, and in turn another sort where animals are concerned. Yes, absolutely, you've made a very keen and courageous division. But let's try to avoid this happening to us again. What sort of thing? Says young Socrates. The visitor says, let's not take off one small part on its own, leaving many large ones behind, and without reference to real classes. Let the part being a real class along with it. It's a really fine thing to separate off immediately what one is searching for from the rest, if one gets it right. As you thought you had the right division just before, and hurried the argument on, seeing it leading to human beings. But in fact, my friend, it's not safe to make thin cuts. It's safer to go along cutting through the middle of things. And that way, one will be more likely to encounter real classes. This makes all the difference in relation to philosophical investigations. Young Socrates says, what do you mean by this, visitor? I must try to tell you still more clearly, Socrates. out of goodwill towards your natural endowments. In the present circumstances, I have to say, it is impossible to show what I mean with absolute completeness, but I must bring it just a little farther forward for the sake of clarity. Well then, what sort of thing are you saying we weren't doing right just now in our divisions? The visitor responds, this sort of thing. It's as if someone tried to divide the human race into two and made the cut in the way that most people here carve things up, taking the Greek race away as one, separate from all of the rest, and to all the other races together, which are unlimited in number, which don't mix with one another, and don't share the same language, calling this collection by a single appellation, barbarian. Because of this single appellation, they expect it to be a single family or class too. Another example would be if someone thought that he was dividing number into two real classes by cutting off the number 10,000 from all the rest, separating it off as a single class, and impositing a single name for all the rest supposed here too, that though getting the name this class 2 came into existence, a single one apart from the other. But I imagine the division would be done better, more by real classes and more into two, if one cut number by means of even and odd, and the human race in its turn by means of male and female, and only split off Lydians or Phrygians or anyone else and range them against all the rest when one has at a loss as how to split in such a way that each of the halves split off was simultaneously a real class and a part. Young Socrates says, quite right. But this very thing, how is one to see it more plainly, that class and part are not the same but different from each other? The visitor says, an excellent response, Socrates. But what you demand is no light thing. We have already wandered far away from the discussion we proposed, and you are telling us to wander even more. Well, as for now, let's go back where we were, which seems the reasonable thing to do, and these other things we'll pursue like trackers on another occasion, when we have the time. However, there is one thing you must absolutely guard against, and that is ever to suppose that you have heard from me a plain account of the matter. Young Socrates says, which? That class and part are different from each other. What should I say I've heard from you? That whenever there is a class of something, it is necessarily also a part of whatever thing it is called a class of, but it is not at all necessary that a part is a class. You must always assert, Socrates, that this is what I say rather than the other way around. I shall do just that. Tell me, then, about the next thing. What's that? The point from which our digression brought us to where we are now. I think it was pretty much the point at which you were asked how to divide herd rearing, and you said with great keenness that there are two classes of living creatures, one human, and a second single one consisting of all the rest, animals, or the animals, together. True, says young Socrates. And to me, you appeared then to think that in taking away a part you had left behind the rest as in its turn a single class, consisting of all of them, because you had the same name, animals, to apply to all of them. This too was as you say. The visitor says, and yet, my courageous friend, maybe, if by chance there is some other animal which is rational, as for example the crane seems to be, or some other such creature, and which perhaps distributes names on the same principles as you, it might oppose cranes as one class to all other beings, and putting them into the same category, which it would call by no other name except perhaps animals. So let's try to be very wary of everything of this sort. How? By not dividing the class of living creatures as a whole in order to lessen the risk of its happening to us. Yes, we must certainly avoid it. Yes, says the visitor, and we are going wrong in this way just at that point. How so? Says young Socrates. So that is the end of those 2 pages. So we've reached an interesting point. Up until now, it's been simple in the sense that we're just working on dividing. We're getting to something. It's the road to something interesting. And while there has been some interesting thoughts here and there, I think these 2 pages here, we're finally getting into one of the first concepts that is going to be extremely important to understand. I think this was mentioned a little bit earlier. I know for sure that it was mentioned in a footnote, but I'm not really sure if it was explicitly mentioned. That we are getting into the idea of classes. And we're now outlining, defining, in a little bit more of a rigorous methodological sense of exactly how we ought to go about cutting things into 2, such that we can boil things down to their simplest components and elements. As we will find, it's not sufficient to make any old cut. This dilemma came up earlier when I said that there are issues with the way that the visitor had cut early on. And there were some things that went by the wayside that just didn't necessarily need to be reconciled at that immediate moment. And for all the messiness that can occur at the sort of the higher levels, I think we ought not to let that take us away from what the visitor has to say about being prudent when performing our cuts. So that being said, I want to go back just a little bit to bring back into mind exactly where we left off. So from the previous page, the visitor says, but we'll certainly not find the statesman rearing individual creatures, like some ox driver or groom, but rather resembling a horse breeder or cowherd. When it comes to rearing living creatures, are we to call the shared rearing of many creatures together a sort of herd rearing, or collective rearing? Young Socrates says, whichever turns out to fit, in the course of the argument. To that the visitor says, well said, Socrates. And if you persevere in not paying serious attention to names, you will be seen the richer in wisdom as you advance to old age. But now we must do just as you instruct. Do you see how by showing the collective rearing of herds to be twin in form, one will make what is now being sought in double the field, then be sought in half of that? So the first thing that I want to point out here is what young Socrates has to say in response to the visitor's question. When it comes to rearing living creatures, are we to call the shared rearing of many creatures together a sort of herd rearing or collective rearing? Now there's a bit of a deflection on young Socrates' part, in the sense that he doesn't answer specifically. He doesn't take the herd or the collective answer. He says whichever turns out to fit. So there's the implication that, well, let's try both and see what happens. Certainly, I think one can identify that there are some commonalities between herd rearing and collective rearing. In a herd, there's a plurality of identities. In a collective, there's a plurality of identities. Now, perhaps collective rearing is poorly defined, where herd rearing is more understood, more implicitly understood. And we understand what it means in terms of governance for herd rearing. It requires patience and grace, surely, but also control and intense boundary setting, such that the herd does not get too far afield and spread out or get eaten by predators. They have to be sort of a close-knit apparatus. They have to constantly be course-corrected on the part of the herder or the extension of the herder, like the dogs or whatever. Now, the collective rearing, I think, is where we might find some gray area, and we can think of something like the human perspective and then the more animalistic perspective. Now, we'll have to speak of this, of course, when we get to what the visitor has to say about classes, but we're not quite there yet. The other interesting thing is the visitor's response to what young Socrates said. He had a positive response. He thought that this, I want to say nonchalant, but it's not necessarily nonchalant. It's the attitude of wishing to see which one works best, like a puzzle piece. And again, it implies a willingness to explore and to be wrong. Now, the visitor says something that's a bit convoluted in my mind, at least at the first couple passes. So I want to spend a little bit of time and try to understand exactly what he means by the next couple of sentences here. He says, "But now we must do as you instruct." So it's not really a matter of getting out of the situation on the part of young Socrates. Young Socrates now has to participate. He has to make the division. He has to try the puzzle piece and see if it fits. He says, "Do you see how by showing the collective rearing of herds to be twin in form?" So what does he mean by that? The collective rearing of herds, twin in form. That there is this idea given a twin. Let's take two of my pawns, two chess pieces here. I place them side by side. I can say that they are twins. What makes them twins? Because they have similar characteristics. They may differ in some respects in terms of being separate identities, but in terms of their physical appearance, they are the same. Now, by doing so, by combining these things together, we have robbed ourselves from an interpretation of one identity. Like if we were to look out at this field, and there are plenty of different things in the fields, if we put one major class of things together with another major class of things, the mind may not necessarily register the important ways in which they are different, and thereby missing something. Who knows what it is, but something potentially important. And so it's a statement to young Socrates to be prudent, essentially, in where he places his division. Now, before I move on, there's one more way in which I think that this is important. I mentioned earlier that if we see this double field and we place things together in one group, let's say flowering shrubs and non-flowering shrubs, these two things are different. And so if there is something that we were looking for that is a non-flowering shrub, putting it together with a flowering shrub is only going to expand our search distance. And so it would be necessary to make the distinction between the two, to separate them, so we can identify which one we're actually after. So at this point, young Socrates says, "I shall try my hardest." it seems to me that there is a different sort of rearing of human beings, and in turn another sort where animals are concerned. Now, in my mind, this isn't a bad division. From earlier, the collective sort was a bit vague anyway. We have to keep in mind about where we're going. What are we after? So we're looking for the statesman. Now, of course, the statesman is involved in human affairs, not so much involved in the affairs of animals. Now, much like in the collective sense, there's a bit of a vague experience or expression here, in the sense that the visitor has moved us up a level when he combined the identities of the collective rearing and the herd rearing into the collective rearing of herds. And he does this, I think, in part to give young Socrates a chance to split it in two again. But there's also the consideration of what he said earlier, having the two separate things of the collective and the herd. And now, just remembering about where we have been, starting with knowledge, we've moved to the theoretical. From the theoretical, we've moved to the directive. From the directive, we've moved to the self-directive. From the self-directive, for the sake of coming into being, production, creation, we have the inanimate and animate. Of the animate, now we are discussing collective rearing, and we're getting a little bit more specific. So the visitor says, let's try to avoid this from happening again. Now, in this text that I'm reading, this is in italics. He says, let's not take off one small part of its own, leaving many large ones behind, and without reference to real classes. There's a couple of things here. We have to figure out what real classes are, what he means by this. And he mentions we should not take off one small part on its own, leaving many large ones behind. So in thinking about the human division and the animal division, it's difficult for me at the outset to understand exactly why we have taken a small piece of something. Now, of collective rearing, I suppose there are plenty of places that we can go. Collective rearing has to do with multiplicity, and it has to do with bringing up, raising. And so if we think about it in this way, if we divide multiplicity, or if we divide raising up, what are we then to have? We can see that a type of multiplicity, perhaps, if we divide it into something. Now, a type would be humans or animals, surely, but that would be a rather small piece of it. If we're looking for the statesman, maybe we just stick with the human being. And of collective rearing, we can have type of rearing. And perhaps this would be a bit more specific to where we are currently. And so without reference to real classes, that would imply that splitting this into human beings and other sorts where animals are concerned, is not a real class in this distinction. The visitor says, let the part being a real class along with it. It's a really fine thing to separate off immediately what one is searching for from the rest, if one gets it right, as you thought you had the right division just before, and hurried the argument on, seeing it leading to human beings. But in fact, my friend, it's not safe to make thin cuts. So as far as I can interpret, this thin cut is thin because, for the very reason that I had begun to speak about when I mentioned collective rearing, or to use the visitor's language, collective rearing of herds, that the concept of multiplicity and the concept of raising up is much deeper than the human and the animal. If we went down the human route, we would still have to divide the human, but we may have to go back up a step for the collective rearing bit. So we'd have to say collective rearing of humans, but then we would still be left in the same sort of place. We have to break this down into something that's meaningful, that gets us somewhere. So the visitor, he says, as you thought, you had the right division just before and hurried the argument on, seeing it leading to human beings. And again, he mentions the human beings. It's this reiteration that this attempt at division is not a class. It's safer to go along cutting through the middle of things, as I think that we have done. And that way, one will more likely come to encounter a real class. Now, I think the definition of a real class is not that there is no relationship between some prior division and the new division. The human being has, and the collective rearing of human beings has some relation to collective rearing in general. So the mistake is not, again, in the relationship. It more has to do with the identity of the thing of the higher level. If we misunderstood knowledge, then breaking it down into something other than theoretical and practical may be either better or worse, depending on our understanding of knowledge. If our understanding of knowledge is high or good, our division of it would be probably good. Because by our understanding of the intricacies of knowledge, we can see where a potential type might emerge. And the same goes for the theoretical, the directive, the animate, and the inanimate. So we reach this point now where the visitor indicates to young Socrates that we have to going about doing right to our divisions. So the visitor says, in this way, it's as if someone tried to divide the human race into two and made the cut in the way that most people here carve things up, taking the Greek race away as one, separate from all of the rest, and to all the other races together, which are unlimited in number, which don't mix with one another, and don't share the same language, calling this collection by a single appellation barbarian. So let's test our hypothesis. If we take the human race, we divide it into two. What are we dividing? Well, we could say human and race. That would probably be one of the most fundamental. We could say a little bit more about the human being, a little bit more about race. And we can get, I think, a bit more specific about each of those. where we see this go wrong is that when the slice is too thin, in the sense that instead of separating out maybe the human from race, or what can we say? This is where it becomes difficult. We could say maybe soul and, again, a type of multiplicity. Culture. Much like my difficulties with our earlier levels of division, I find the same difficulties now with my own. But nonetheless, let's not get caught there. Focusing on the superficiality of the human being and just race, or rather I should say, of separating out Greek and everything else under barbarian. The thin slice is Greece. And so we know that of the whole, we have cut a small sliver, Greek, and then everybody else is barbarian. And we know that if we divide it into two, we'll be more effective. So there has to be, in terms of identity, there has to be a uniting factor among the races that is greater than the cultural desire to just take the Greek elevated above of everybody else, which is considered the barbarian. Which means that we would have to include some of what is seen as the barbarian cultures into our understanding of human races. How broad this concept would go, I don't know. How far we would unify, I'm not sure. But I think the point is that there is this place of movement, and that perspective must necessarily shift. We can say that it's objective, I suppose, to a degree, that it has to be objective to find the middle, to split it down the middle. But it's more than that. We have to be willing to sacrifice prejudice in order to find that sweet spot of division. He says, because of this single appellation, they expect it to be a single family or class 2. Another example would be, someone thought that he was dividing number into two real classes by cutting off the number 10,000 from all of the rest. Separating it as a single class. And in positing a single name for all the rest, suppose tier 2, that though getting the name in this class 2 came into existence. A second single one apart from the other. But I imagine the division would be done better, more by real classes, and more into 2, if one cut number by means of even and odd. So here, we might be concerned with 10,000. We might have a particular affection towards the number 10,000. But it is not by our affection that we split number into 10,000 and everything else. We split number by its most center point division. Now again, we can debate on where that center point is, but even and odd is certainly better than 10,000. Because 10,000 is a much smaller slice of the whole than even and odd. Now, I think in my earlier reflection of how to divide the human race, I was a bit too abstract. The visitor says that dividing into male and female is much more approximating the human race situation than Greece and barbarians. There is a much greater fundamental connection to that species. There's less movement between, there's less variability, it is more concrete and known. And he says, and only split off Lydians or Phrygians or anyone else, and range them all against the rest, when one has at a loss as to how to split in such a way that each of the halves split off was simultaneously a real class and apart. So forgive me, but today is a new day. And like always, or like usual, a new day brings new thoughts. I'd like to spend a moment just to reflect on a couple things. It happens to be the evening after work. It's one of the later days. And I find myself now, at the end of the day, fatigued, exhausted, but willing and ready to learn. Sometimes I have a bit of melancholy over the situations for which fatigue offers us a sort of exchange between absence and in absence a potential for rest, or what we are being deceived as rest, or on the other hand, we have to exert ourselves to a tremendous degree to maintain the attention. That's not much of an exchange, of course. What we give up is the possibility for the object of the attentive pursuit. And there are many objects of attentive pursuits. But when we consider good ones, these attentive pursuits are fulfilling. They are more fulfilling than rest. They are certainly more fulfilling than the rest that is offered us by the deceptive fatigue. And so within this spirit, I wish to continue. So, upon reading that last paragraph again, I want to start with when the visitor says, because of this single appellation, they expect it to be a single family or class too. Now, earlier we were developing this image, a very important image by which we identify things. It's clothed in the broader objective of developing the method by which the visitor cuts something in two in order to get down to some fundamental principle. This is in the family of first principles thinking. Now this single appellation, the appellation being barbarian, the expectation of family or class, now we'll ignore family, I suppose, for a moment. That's another type of relation that we really haven't discussed yet, but class, we surely are talking about. The assumption is the dangerous part. I think much like we were talking about with fatigue, that there is this deceptive part of our desire to give into absence. Not necessarily rest. I think rest has its place, and it is good in and of itself. It can be. In the proper context, we all need to sleep, and we all need what is considered leisure. But to be in a posture of mind in absence, in which the mind commits itself to, let's say, something like exploring various short videos that one might find on TikTok or YouTube, and perhaps Instagram. I'm not sure if they have that, but the point is, engaging in these behaviors brings us to that state of mind for which it is absent. Thinking passively. It is using its attentive capacity for all the wonder and the beauty that the human mind is. It uses that to just give information, to give attention to something that somebody else has produced. Now, I don't think that in every situation this is a bad thing, of course, but if it is wound up in the behavior such that the individual is wasting time, continually committing themselves to that passivity of experience, then I think it is quite a negative thing to mind, both in the short term and in the long term. Now, in a like manner, when we consider assumptions or expectations, they expect it to be a single family or class 2. I find something quite similar, that there is a passivity of mind, that because it is convenient, we cause there to be a division at a particular point. The conceited expression of the ancient Greeks, that their culture was the center of all, and that all others were considered barbarians, which is a derogatory statement to all others. I think it does more harm than it does good. I think there is certainly good in nationalism or culturalism, if we are to say that nations did not exist back then in the formal sense. It doesn't really matter. But the ignorance of passivity shines through in many different domains, and this is one where it is possible. I suppose the results can vary based on one's beliefs, but all the same, if this continues over a period of time, I think we can understand that our ability to identify things becomes quite shallow, vain, conceited, as I've mentioned. He goes into another example. If someone thought that he was dividing number into 2 real classes by cutting off the number 10,000, we've been over this, separating it off as a single class, and in positing a single name for all the rest supposed here too, that though getting the name, this class 2 came into existence. A second single one apart from the other. But I imagine the division would be done better, more by real classes, and more into 2, if one cut number by means of even and odd, and the human race in its turn by means of male and female. So let's move on from this. I think we've established this important part of the visitor's classification system. Young Socrates says, "But this very thing, how is one to see it more plainly, that class and part are not the same but different from each other?" So certainly a good question. How would we differentiate class from part? Is there any difference at all? If there is to be a difference, it must be wound up in its practical or functional purpose. So if we take a part of something, we can ask ourselves, what practical purpose does this part serve? The answer may vary depending on the part that's exposed or in question. But when it comes to this methodological perspective, by which is not just cleaving a layer of the onion, it is the cutting of an onion such that we wish to understand it better. It is to see all of the layers of the onion so we can examine it, not just the individual part. The visitor says, "What you demand is no light thing. We have already wandered far away from the discussion we proposed, and you are telling us to wander even more. Well, as for now, let's go back to where we were, which seems the reasonable thing to do, and these other things will pause like trackers on another occasion, when we have the time. However, there is one thing you must absolutely guard against, and that is ever to suppose that you have heard from me a plain account of the matter." So the visitor deflects a little bit here, but recognizes the importance of the question. So going back to our analogy of the onion, I raise the question again, in what way is taking a part of the onion different from classifying the onion? And when I say classifying, it means what we are doing here. We are finding a division point that is not superficial. It is as close as we can get to the identity base. Now, identity base can be a bit variable. There are places that we can cut. Perhaps it's not singular. Like in the human being, I sort of wonder if male and female is the only place that we can cut. And I don't think that this is necessarily the case. I think that there are other foundational aspects of man's experience that we can identify. But after having mentioned male and female, it's really hard to identify another one. So while a part of man may be a particular personality, we could say introvert and extrovert is a fundamental cut. I don't think that would be a bad idea. But in particular, if we are trying to find an example of the human being that is more of a part than that of a class, we would have to imagine more like on the avenue of what young Socrates had to say initially, dividing, if I can get my notebook, collective rearing into herd rearing, or rather maybe I should say I suppose we can stay here, herd rearing and collective rearing, and saying that herd rearing is more of the animals and the collective perhaps more of the human, or just splitting collective rearing in general into the human and the animal. The division itself is not necessarily a bad one. Those are two fundamental divisions, but again, it's not where we are. It's not what we are searching for. We don't take the onion and then cut a tomato to examine the onion. What we wish to do is to stay on course, take the onion, well, we haven't been to this point yet, but when we think about collective rearing and dividing it into two, we are not to go completely off course into something that is somewhat related. A tomato is still a food, where an onion is still a food. It's a common food at that. But rather, we stick with the onion, and we identify its own characteristics. And I think the point about getting off track is sort of poignant. And the reason for that is such a discussion, by its very nature, involves being on track or off track of attention, of attending to what we are trying to identify, going through that process of classifying. Now, young Socrates says, which, in response to what the visitor said. However, there is one thing you must absolutely guard against, and that is ever to suppose that you have heard from me a plain account of the matter. That class and part are different from each other. He says that whenever there is a class of something, it is necessarily also a part of whatever thing it is called a class of. But it is not at all necessary that a part is a class. You must always assert, Socrates, that this is what I say, rather than the other way around. So an important distinction. Let's see if this matches what we were talking about earlier. Whenever there is a class of something, it is necessarily also a part of whatever thing it is called a class of. Now this fits with what we are saying. We can take any example that the visitor used, or even take our onion example. If we divide the onion in an appropriate manner, we have two classes. Of course, we would say that one class, let's say we divided it into half as a symbol towards some fundamental cross-section of the identity in question. Of course, one half of the onion is a part of the whole. It is one half, after all. But it is not at all necessary that a part is a class. Now this is a little bit more difficult, I think. At least it can be. Now this is not to say that a part cannot be a class, but it is to say that in cases of this, what I'm calling just as a placeholder, the unprincipled division, this we may see a part. This we may see just a layer of the onion, and it necessarily limits our understanding. But here I have to wonder about a potential continuum, for even if we have a part, it participates in a class, even if it may not be the class itself. So like, for example, there are many examples, but I participate in a company, but I am not a company. I participate in a relationship with my friend, but I am not my friend. Now we continue, and we arrive back to the point where we were. The visitor says, I think we were pretty much at the point at which you were asked how to divide herd rearing, and you said with great keenness that there were two classes of living creatures, one human, and a second one consisting of all the rest, animals, together. And to me, you appeared then to think that in taking away a part you had left behind the rest as in its turn a single class, consisting of all of them, because you had the same name, animals, to apply to all of them. And yet, my courageous friend, maybe, if by chance there is some other animal which is rational, as for example the crane seems to be, or some other such creature, and which perhaps distributes name on the same principles as you, it might oppose cranes as one class to all other living creatures, and giving itself heirs, taking all the rest together with human beings and putting them into the same category, which it would call by no other name except perhaps animals. So let's try to be very wary of everything of this sort. So there's a powerful insight here, and I sort of debate with myself about if we ought to stay and interpret what the visitor had to say previously, or to just move on to this current passage. I'm thinking about staying with the current passage, and hopefully it'll cover that ground that he exposed to us earlier. But there's an important point here about perception. And this perhaps is where I have to bring up what he said earlier. The issue of the part and the whole. So if I take my notepad and I make a circle, and I cleave off part of this circle with a dotted line. So now I have maybe an eighth of the whole. What I have done is taken this eighth and I've called it the human being, the human being's experience. And I've rejected everything else. I've turned it into a class of its own, as animals. And this is 7/8 of the whole. Now, of this whole, we don't necessarily have to be thinking about the human being or the animals. This is the distinction that was given to us by young Socrates. Remembering that what we are discussing is of dividing herd rearing, or collective rearing, whatever we want to call it as. So the 7/8, the rest, is left behind as in its turn a single class, consisting of all of them, because they had the same name, animals. The visitor flips this around and says, well, what if there's one of the animals, another eighth, perhaps? Now the parts of the whole here doesn't really matter, it's just a general conception so I can understand where we are. The other eighth, let's say, he calls the cranes, that have the same mental capacity as the human being, and now they are perceiving in the same way. Except in their perception, the human being is destroyed as a class, and they are the eighth that matters. They are the Greeks and everybody else are the barbarians. And so we run into this situation of not only having a small part of the whole that is giving itself this class, this identity. It is rather shallowly and superficially classifying everything else as a very broad category, broad identity. When in fact, it would seem that what we would want to do is perhaps not make us split right down the middle, but to make like a crack. And this crack in the top, this dividing line, spreads throughout all or many different areas, different identities. And we can reflect based on that. Of course, we would go deeper and deeper. So the visitor says, we ought not to divide the class of living creatures as a whole in order to lessen the risk of its happening to us. We were going wrong in this way, just at that point. And here we find ourselves on the next page. And so, I'll read them in its totality. The visitor says, of that theoretical knowledge, which was directive, we had a part, I think, of the class concerned with rearing living creatures, one which was concerned with creatures living in herds. True? Young Socrates says yes. Well then, living creatures as a whole together had in effect already at that point been divided by the categories of domesticated and wild. For those that have a nature amenable to domestication are called tame, and those who do not are called wild. Right. But the knowledge we are hunting had to be and still is concerned with tame things, and must be looked for with reference to herd animals. Yes. Well then, let's not divide in the way we did then, looking at everything or in a hurry, just in order to get quickly to statesmanship. It has already put us in a proverbial situation. What situation is that? Says young Socrates. That by not quietly getting on with dividing properly, we have got to our destination more slowly. Yes, visitor, and a fine situation it is. If you say so, in any case, let's go back and try again from the beginning to divide collective rearing. Perhaps, as we go through it in detail, the argument itself will be better able to reveal to you what you are so keen to find. Tell me this. What? Says young Socrates. The visitor says, this. I wonder if perhaps you've heard about it from others. You certainly haven't yourself any direct acquaintance. I know, with the instances of domesticated fish rearing in the Nile and in the king's ponds. In ornamental fountains, at any rate, you may perhaps have seen them. Absolutely. I've both seen these and heard about the others from many people. The visitor says, and again, examples of goose rearing and crane rearing, even if you haven't traveled to other plains of Thessaly, you've certainly heard about these and believe that they exist. Of course. Look, it's for this purpose that I've asked you all of this. Of the rearing of herd animals, some has to do with creatures living in water, some also with creatures that live on dry land. It does. Do you agree, then, that we must split the expert knowledge of collecting rearing into two in this way, allocating one of its two parts to each of these, calling one aquatic rearing, the other dry land rearing? I do. And we certainly shan't ask, in this case, to which of the two sorts of expertise kingship belongs. It's quite clear to anyone. Quite. Everybody would divide the dry land rearing into a sort of herd rearing. How? By separating it by reference to the winged and what goes on foot. Very true. Well then, mustn't we look for the statesmanship in relation to what goes on foot? Or don't you think that, practically, even the simplest of minds suppose so? I do. And the expertise to do with the management of creatures that go on foot, we must show it being cut into two, like an even number. Clearly. Now it seemed that there are two routes to be seen stretching out in the direction of the part towards which our argument has hurried. One of them quicker, dividing a small part off against a large one, while the other more closely observes the principle we were talking about earlier. that one should cut in the middle as much as possible, but is longer. We can go down whichever of the two routes we like. Young Socrates says, "What if I were to ask if it is impossible to follow both?" An extraordinary suggestion, if you mean both at once, but clearly it is possible to take each in turn. Then I opt for taking both in turn. The visitor says, "That's easy, since the part of that remains is short. If we had been at the beginning of or in the middle of our journey, the instruction would have been difficult to carry out. As it is, since you think that we should take this option, let's go down the long route first. While we are fresher, we'll travel it more easily. Observe the division. Tell me what it is. Of tame things that live in herds, we find those that go on foot, naturally divided into two. By what? By the fact that some of them come into being without horns, some with horns. Evidently. Well then, divide the management of creatures that go on foot by assigning it to each of these two parts, using a descriptive phrase for the results of the divisions. For if you want to give them names, it will have to be more complicated than necessary." So it's clear to me that this took a turn that I did not necessarily expect. And I still have questions about why the visitor is dividing things in the way that he has. A part of me feels that he is dividing in a way that, as he sees the contrary in young Socrates, he does himself. And this is something that I'll have to reconcile. But this will have to wait until the next episode. So until next time.